Apparently, the Russians are advancing even more, even faster, even more dramatically in the Zaporozhye region. And so I think it will be much more difficult for the whole Western powers that back Ukrainian government to maintain the narrative that, the thing is a stalemate, that they could turn it around. They could defeat the Russians. The Russians are losing a lot of men, but they're not making any progress. But it's clear that the Russian army is gaining in strength, not losing. Even size-wise, the Russian army is growing, which might indicate that they are perhaps even preparing for a large push to really push all the way to the Dnieper River. And I think that this will be a complete and total defeat of the Project Ukraine. If these reports are true, then the Western narrative collapses, is not losing, it's preparing for something bigger. And if Russia pushes all the way to the Dnieper, that's not a setback for Ukraine. It's the end of the entire Western project around it. Washington and Brussels know this, but admitting it would mean admitting the war never matched the rhetoric. As far as Ukraine goes, that could be close to the end of war, So maybe in a way, good news for Ukrainian people. The government in Kiev will have to change. It'll have to go back into Russia's orbit. But then, that's the defeat for NATO and for the European Union and for Great Britain. I'm not putting the United States into that same category because it's very clear that Donald Trump has extricated the United States from the conflict. If Ukraine is pushed back into Russia's orbit, the war ends, but it's a political disaster for NATO, the EU, and Britain. And with Trump pulling the US out of the equation, they're left facing that defeat alone, which which was not clean, obvious, and surgical. Because the United States involvement in the Project Ukraine has already been set up and rigged so that it would be difficult for Trump to just say, okay, goodbye, we're done with this. So it took some time. But I think that the critical moment happened when Trump declined to provide a security guarantee to Kiev, because that was the tripwire for World War II. That is, for an open conflict between Russia and the combined West. And Trump said no. So now, all they're left with are measures of sheer desperation. So, the last Mokin, Emmanuel Macron, still wants to finagle, somehow, to put French troops in Ukraine. But you made it almost impossible for any president to walk away cleanly. So Trump had to pull out step by step. And the real turning point came when he refused to give Kiev a security guarantee. That refusal killed any chance of a direct NATO-Russia war. Now all the West has left, desperate gestures, like Macron talking about sending French troops. But without U.S. backing, those troops wouldn't change the outcome. They'd only become targets. You know, if we go by historical precedents, I think that the idea that the Europeans have, like with World War I, World War II, is we're just going to get ourselves into a world of trouble. And then the Americans will not be able to just leave us alone. They're going to have to come to our defenses. So this is all they have at the moment. And then their gamble is that Trump will not be able to resist the calls to come and rescue them. I don't know. That gamble might work out, it might not work. But even if it did, even if somehow, at the last hour they managed to bring the United States into that war, that still wouldn't be able to turn it around. I mean, Obama in 2014 declined to open a war against Russia because they understood that Russia has escalatory dominance in that region, that winning against Russia would be extremely unlikely. And I think that today, it would take a miracle. And I don't know what kind of a miracle it is. Westerners are good at using printing presses, but you can't print logistics. You can't print weaponry. You can't print, troops. Europe is gambling that if things get bad enough, America will be forced to step in like past wars. But even if they pulled the U.S. in, it wouldn't change the outcome. Russia holds the advantage, and you can't print the troops, weapons, or logistics needed to reverse that. You can't print, an these things. You have to have them, and they have to be integrated. And that just doesn't exist. So even if the United States somehow was coerced into this war, I think the West would still lose. You can't manufacture an air force or air defenses overnight, and the West simply doesn't have the integrated structure needed for a fight like this. So even if the U.S. were dragged in, the outcome wouldn't change. The West would still lose. So I think that there's a certain desperation to not recognize reality and just keep the thing going as long as possible. And then I think that those who are really the real instigators of this war, which I think is the financier oligarchy on the axis of London, Paris, and Wall Street, that as far as they're concerned, as long as the war is going on, you have a chance that Russia might fall into some kind of a crisis. Vladimir, something bad might happen, which would maybe open an opportunity for them. Some kind of an opening for them to again try to infiltrate Russia, to organize a regime change operation, to bring in some kind of Maria Corina Machado, to the Kremlin, that would open the gates of Troy wide. He's saying the war is being dragged out in desperation, kept alive by powerful financial interests, hoping Russia collapses from within or Putin falls. It's less about winning and more about waiting for a miracle that likely isn't coming, and then that they could take over Russia. And then, the dream continues, because then they would probably weaponize Russia against China in the same way that they've weaponized Ukraine against Russia. And they get their big prize, which is control over the whole Eurasian continent. Well, that's a long, short dream, but it is possible for as long as the conflict is continuing. And this is why we had that project Alchemy in Britain, which was established at the beginning of the special military operation in 2022. A bunch of British academics, intelligence operatives, and military generals who basically put together like a strategic policy paper in which they emphasized in a few places that the key, the imperative is to keep the Ukrainians fighting. And this, coincided with Boris Johnson going to Kiev when the peace was already in hand. It was already agreed upon almost completely in every detail. And then Boris Johnson came to Kiev and convinced Zelensky and his government, don't sign any peace. We have your back. Fight it out. So, 1 million or 2 million Ukrainian men later, they could find themselves in a lot of trouble because they've done a lot of things wrong. They will not be able to conceal their role, Also lose the privilege to write the history of this war, which is extremely important, because if they prevailed, they could write the history saying, evil man Putin wanted to reconquer, the Soviet Empire. And so, he wanted, to gain Ukrainian territory. And all of the nuances that led to the war could be swept under the carpet. As it is, I think the other side will be writing the history of this war. And, a lot of the people who are in power today in Europe are not going to be in power anymore. And let's call it, the reactionary force will gain a great deal of credibility. People who have been against the war, against net zero policies, against destroying the pipelines, against shutting down the nuclear power plants, because, the actual energy transition that was imposed upon European nations is part of that conflict. So that whole house of cards then comes down, and somebody's going to have to also lose the privilege to write the history of this war, which is extremely important, because if they prevailed, they could write the history saying, evil man Putin wanted to reconquer, the Soviet Empire. And so, he wanted, to gain Ukrainian territory, and all of the nuances that led to the war could be swept under the carpet. As it is, I think the other side will be writing the history of this war, and, a lot of the people who are in power today in Europe are not going to be in power anymore. And let's call it, the reactionary force will gain a great deal of credibility. People who have been against the war, against net zero policies, against destroying the pipelines, against shutting down the nuclear power plants, because the actual energy transition that was imposed upon European nations is part of that conflict, so that whole house of cards then comes down, and somebody's going to have to be responsible for it. He's laying out the long-shot fantasy behind this war. The belief that if Ukraine keeps fighting, Russia might collapse, Putin might fall, and the West could then hijack Russia and eventually use it against China. That's why peace was blocked in 2022, and why Ukrainian lives were spent to keep the war going. But now the narrative is falling apart. They won't get to rewrite history. They won't be able to hide their role. And when this ends, many of today's European leaders won't survive politically. The whole house of cards comes down, and someone will have to answer for it. How will economic power be impacted by this war, or the outcome of the war, to be precise? Well, for the West, it's going to be catastrophic, because the Western financial system is absolutely starved for collateral. And without new collateral, all you have is printing money out of thin air, backed by nothing, which leads into hyperinflation. Hyperinflation basically is you have many precedents for this. But if you look at Weimar Republic in Germany 100 years ago, or the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think these are probably valid precedents to try to predict the future of the European Union. I think that the United States has a much better maneuvering space. I think that they will probably be able to skirt this crisis to a good extent. But I think that as far as the European Union, NATO and the United Kingdom are concerned, this is going to be dismal. This is going to be absolutely dismal for Ukraine. It's going to be an improvement for sure. Economically, the West faces real disaster. With no collateral left, they're relying on money printing, which leads to inflation and eventual collapse. Just like past empires, the US has room to maneuver, but Europe, NATO, and the UK don't. And ironically, Ukraine may end up better off than them once the war ends. Ukraine has been one of performing economies in the world since gaining independence in 1991. Maybe the worst, at least between 1991 and 2014. Ukraine has been the worst performing economy in the world. Now it's been decimated. Its population has gone from about, I think, 52 million in 1991 to, I think, less than 25 million today. Much of its industry has been destroyed. They lost millions of men. So killed in action, disappeared, wounded beyond repair, So it's going to be they are at a low point from which it's going to be relatively easy to bring about an economic revival for Ukraine. And I think that should be a very hopeful moment, because the potential, by integrating with let's call it the multipolar world, are enormous. We'll see that'll, That's not going to be immediate, but it could happen relatively quickly. And I'll just give you a staggering example of how these things can change if there's a will to change it, political will. In 4 years, about less than 5 years ago, Azerbaijan embarked on a major project of developing their infrastructure, and I was there at a Verona Eurasian Economic Conference in 2022 when these projects were starting. And at the time, my impression was, wow, this is a very hopeful moment. People were discussing very concrete, very constructive economic development ideas and projects. Between then and now, today, No has built 4,000 kilometers of highways. They built years. Ukraine's economy has collapsed so completely that rebuilding it may actually be easier than fixing Europe's. With half its population gone and industry destroyed, it's at rock bottom. But that also means there's nowhere to go but up. And with China, Russia, and the BRICS bloc ready to invest, Ukraine could integrate into a new multipolar economy fast. Countries like Azerbaijan have rebuilt entire infrastructures in under 5 years. Proof that when political will exists, recovery can happen quicker than anyone expects. And the total cost of the whole investment was about $5 billion. So this is what can happen when a society's resources are not being wasted on warfare. And now I'm not talking about Azerbaijan, as in Azerbaijan. This could, somebody could say, well, this is all controversial, and I wouldn't trust Azerbaijan. Whatever. I'm just talking about what can be achieved when you allocate the society's resource. Allocate the society's resources and investment to productive uses, to development of infrastructure, of industries, and so forth. And so, Ukraine is going to be an extremely important country, for Eurasian integrations, because it's it is on the Black Sea. It's a buffer between East and West. It has one of the world's largest agricultural potentials, with extremely fertile land and coal and energy resources. So it's a rich country, except that under the Western tutelage, it's been the whole society has been engineered just for this moment, just to use it as a bludgeon against Russia. If it were used to make life better for Ukrainian people, very, very different outcomes would Ukraine has been finally defeated. I have been possible. And I think that once this war is over, once this project, think that from that point on,